What you're looking at here is a 120-year-old photograph taken in Berlin. The buildings still stand, but today, the one on the right looks quite different. As you can see, all the ornamentation is gone, and what is left is a somewhat incomplete structure. This phenomenon is called Entstuckung, which is the deliberate removal of stucco from buildings. It happened all over Germany, and nowhere is it more visible than here in the German capital. In fact, you can hardly walk down any of the city's streets without noticing one of these odd houses. They are everywhere. But why? When the Germans began tearing down stucco, they never intended to remove it all. Many buildings, despite being covered in ornaments, weren't even considered. Strange as it may seem, there is an explanation for this. Turns out, nearly all the buildings stripped of stucco date back to a specific period, the late 19th and early 20th centuries. To understand what caused this development, we'll begin our journey in Dresden. By the mid-19th century, the Industrial Revolution had reached Saxony. Factories attracted workers from the countryside, and the population in Dresden exploded. New boroughs sprung up, and they took on a new shape. For one, the streets were different. Twisting alleyways were now substituted with straight boulevards. Moreover, the buildings differed. Industrial techniques allowed for rapid construction, but these, then new, apartment buildings looked nothing like what we today associate with mass-produced housing. Instead, they looked old. That is because they were products of a movement called Historicism. As the name suggests, Historicism drew inspiration from the past. It gained popularity for various reasons, with the most significant being industrialization. With more people finding themselves in rapidly changing and impersonal environments, the need for stability grew. As such, architects and artists began using elements from styles that harken back to simpler times. Gothic arches, Greek columns, and timbered facades all re-emerged, not only in Germany, but throughout the West. This resulted in some of the world's most iconic structures. And, upon closer inspection, you'll notice something interesting. Many of these buildings didn't simply borrow from a particular style, but also began mixing various ones, giving rise to structures that could almost be considered new styles themselves. The term for this is eclecticism, which marks the peak craziness or awesomeness for this whole movement. Take this example from Dresden. At its core, we have a brick building, which is typical for the area. But look closer and you'll find Romanesque and Gothic arches, Baroque domes, and the most striking feature of them all, a timbered framed attic. Obviously, most buildings didn't take it this far, but you get the idea. Okay, so you had all these buildings using some design elements that were popular in the past. Where exactly is the problem? Well, just a few kilometers away from Schillerplatz was a young architecture student who was witnessing this movement firsthand. His name was Adolf Loos, and he would go on to become one of its most vocal critics, a path that would eventually lead him to Prague. Turns out, Adolf, this one, had a quite different view of what constitutes a good building, and his designs leave no doubt that ornamentation was no part of it. In his famous essay, Ornament and Crime, Loos attacks his contemporaries from various angles, where perhaps his most widespread critique, also commonly echoed today, is that ornamentation is disingenuous. Consider a Gothic cathedral or a timbered framed house. These buildings look the way they do, in part because the technique necessary to construct them is visible in the design. Gothic arches and flying buttresses made it possible to build enormous cathedrals. Likewise, the structural integrity of these cute wooden houses comes from their frames. Therefore, Loos would consider these honest structures as they reflect local knowledge from a certain time. Now, our eclectic example, on the other hand, doesn't really use these design elements out of necessity. The frames are plastered on, and the arches serve no unique purpose. Therefore, they, like many of the other elements, serve a decorative role, which to Loos renders them fake. Moreover, since these are essentially cultural expressions, Loos also questioned their artistic value. Back then, ornaments were often mass-produced instead of being unique pieces of art. Lastly, he compared ornaments to wearing a mask. Not only does it hide a building's true function and material, but it could also be seen as a symptom of a society caring more about appearance than solving real problems, such as poor living conditions. Alright, as we now have an understanding of the essay, it becomes clear why its proponents went on to design very different buildings. Loos himself became a modernist pioneer, advocating for his own concept called Raumplan, as well as emphasizing the importance of craftsmanship. Other modernists didn't necessarily share all his convictions, but they too rejected ornamentation for the reasons laid out, the well-known case here being the Bauhaus movement. Eventually, these ideas began to flourish in liberal Weimar Germany, and in addition to all the new modern buildings being constructed, the first wave of stucco removal emerged. Berlin in particular became a laboratory, so to speak. As the capital and the cultural center of the Republic, it attracted architects eager to redesign historicist facades. How many buildings they were able to transform remains unknown, but generally speaking, the first wave of de-stuccofication was minor. This can partially be explained by its abrupt end due to the rise of the National Socialists. Adolf, this one, had a strong disdain for Bauhaus and similar movements. As such, members of the avant-garde faced persecution, and their activities were shut down. But perhaps somewhat surprisingly, the Nazis didn't actually oppose the removal of stucco itself. On the contrary, they sometimes encouraged it. There were two reasons for this. First, their ideology revolved around Germanness, which led them to view many historicist buildings as foreign and fake. Second, they sought to create their 1,000-year empire. By getting rid of ornaments and paint, and instead emphasizing proportions and scale, their buildings could maintain their appearance for millennia. Well-known examples reflecting this ethos are, of course, the Nazi megastructures. However, the same idea also applied to normal buildings. In fact, plans were made to redesign entire towns accordingly. Take this example from Bohemia. Here, there are several modifications, and apart from the porticos, the most striking difference is the simplification of the facades. A closer look reveals that this is partly due to the absence of stucco. Now, if you visit this town today, the stucco is still there. These large-scale projects were only meant to begin after a Nazi victory. This is why during the whole regime, Entstuckung remained a scattered phenomena, mostly affecting isolated buildings like this one in Nuremberg. What would be the true catalyst leading to widespread adaptation was, however, the war. As many German cities had been heavily damaged, questions about their future began to surface. One concern in particular was what to do with all the damaged facades. Besides being scars from a brutal past, crumbling stucco also posed a safety hazard. With no resources to spend on extensive facade renovations, tearing it down was often the pragmatic choice. That being said, this massive wave wasn't solely driven by pragmatists. Other countries, also greatly impacted by the war, saw no similar push. Therefore, one might speculate that one of the main drivers was German guilt fueling a desire to escape its past. If so, this could explain why Berlin, in particular, became the epicenter. Regardless, modernist ideals became dominant on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Thus, the reshaping of historicist facades to mimic clean, modern aesthetics was mostly encouraged. This would go on for almost 20 years before significant pushback emerged. Leading the revolt was an architect named Werner Duttmann. Interestingly, Duttmann himself was a modernist who had begun to question the rationale behind de-stuccofication. In his view, the removal of stucco from historicist buildings was an attack on their authenticity. These buildings were simply products of a specific era, and by transforming them to something else, they lost that historical connection. Furthermore, it was argued that because the facades were designed to be ornate, removing all the stucco made the buildings look awkward and incomplete. By the 70s, public opinion had shifted and preservation efforts became widespread. Fast forward to today, and many historicist buildings are now protected. What's more, the districts where you find them tend to be among the most popular in every German city. Now, it is important to note that this is not entirely due to aesthetics. Historicist districts are always more than just the facades, as they feature a distinct urban pattern. Nonetheless, ornaments are once again in vogue. The city of Berlin has introduced guidelines for restoring these facades, and nationwide there is a rise of a new movement which is ever so slightly reintroducing stucco. So, who knows? Maybe the future of German architecture can be found in its past.